Welcome back to week 2 of my Project Pantry. My name is Kara Craddock and I am a registered dietitian. I am trying to use up a lot, if not everything, in my pantry, in my freezers to just avoid spending money on groceries. Now, my husband is completely in charge of what we eat for dinner. So my Project Pantry, I'm mostly focusing on breakfast and lunch. We do have a ton of stuff that we will be using from our pantry and from our freezers for dinner, but I have also told him that like whatever he wants to make for dinner is still totally fine. But we have a budget of at most $50 per week for our grocery budget. And I am finding even after the first week, just because we had been gone, we just didn't have as much fresh produce. And so if I have to start buying things for breakfast and lunch, it will probably be some fresh produce. And that's especially true because I tend to put my meals together using the MyPlate method, or at least pretty close to the MyPlate method, which incorporates, half of your plate being color, fruits or vegetables. So in order to do that, I have some frozen fruits and vegetables. I have some like applesauce, but I will sooner rather than later probably need some fresh fruit, and it is apple season and I love apples. And so yeah, you will probably see apples being purchased at some point. But for this week, before I get into showing you my meal prep for this week, if you haven't already watched my pantry walkthrough in video 1 or week 1 of the series, you might want to just watch that if you are curious about kind of the insane amount of stuff that I have in my pantry and freezer. We have a ton of stuff. So if that interests you, that exists, and you can see like what I am pulling from, what I am working from. So this week I started to get into playing the game of what's in my refrigerator that's gonna go bad and how can I use that up or freeze it. So if you are doing a no buy, low buy, Project Pantry, whatever, the first thing you wanna do definitely is start with what's fresh, what's in your refrigerator that is gonna go bad sooner rather than later. So I mentioned this in my video last week, but I had cottage cheese that I knew was probably gonna be the first thing in my refrigerator to go, but I was not quite in the mood last week to finish that cottage cheese because I had been eating it for a few days already. That gets me into thinking about what I have to use right now versus what I can freeze. There are some things that just freeze better than others. And so you want to be thinking about either other ways to transform those foods or ways to incorporate them into other foods that freeze better. So I'll give you a little bit of a list. Speaking of that cottage cheese, dairy typically does not freeze all that well, especially things like cottage cheese and yogurt. Those will not freeze and then thaw really in a way that you're going to want to eat. You are going to want to eat those before they go bad or turn them into something because you're not going to be able to freeze that. Now milk, if it's a lower fat percentage, like skim milk, 1% milk, it can freeze just fine. And some people find that if they thaw that milk out and then they just like shake it really vigorously or kind of whisk it together, they can get the fat and the water to kind of recombine and it tastes just fine. But a lot of people, what they say is it's actually after you freeze it, it's better to use it in like baked goods. One thing to keep in mind if you are going to freeze milk is that because it does have a lot of water, it will expand to some extent when it freezes. And so you don't want to necessarily freeze a whole gallon of milk. You want to freeze your milk in a container that's going to be airtight and will also have at least an inch of space at the top or a little bit of room in that container so that it can expand. Yogurt, Greek yogurt especially, just the way that it's made, it will last in the refrigerator, even after it's been opened, a lot longer than cottage cheese will last. So I have like half a container of yogurt, one of the big tub containers from Costco. I have a full one in my refrigerator downstairs and I have about half of one in my refrigerator up here and it's open. But I also had a big container of cottage cheese that just had a little bit left in it. And that cottage cheese is not going to stick around as long as the yogurt is. So I'm going to prioritize using that cottage cheese first. Now, again, if you're just not feeling like eating that thing in its raw form, like I was not feeling eating cottage cheese, you can generally use dairy, cottage cheese, things like that to transform them into something else, a baked good or something that you can then bake and save. And that's actually what I'm going to do this week. And I will tell you about it when I get into like my meal prep this week. Now, I am not the kind of person or the kind of dietitian that believes you need to have protein in everything and you need to be putting cottage cheese in everything. I actually rarely do this. I am only doing it because my cottage cheese was about to go bad. Another thing that doesn't freeze very well is shelled eggs. So like a whole egg still in its shell. Eggs have a pretty long shelf life, just as is in their shell. So you may not even need to worry too much about that. But if you are getting to what you think is the end of the shelf life for your eggs, you can actually crack those eggs into a container and whisk them together so the egg yolk and the egg white are mixed together. Maybe put a pinch of salt in there and then you can freeze that container and they will actually freeze pretty nicely. You can separate your egg whites from your egg yolks and you could freeze them in 2 separate containers and that would actually work as well. You can, of course, also hard boil eggs, and if you hard boil eggs, they will last a very long time as well. adding a little bit more shelf life to your eggs, especially because it's easiest to peel eggs that have been hard-boiled after they're a little bit old. If you're going to hard-boil eggs, ideally you want to use slightly older eggs. Now, if you don't like scrambled eggs, you don't like hard-boiled eggs, then you might want to use those eggs to incorporate them, again, into a baked good or something like that you can freeze or use up. Another thing that isn't gonna save very well are like high water content greens. So this would be any lettuce that is really light in color. The lighter in color, the more water a green or lettuce has. So things like romaine, those do not freeze very well. And so you're gonna wanna use those up sooner rather than later because there's not much you can transform them into that will freeze well, and they're not gonna last very long on their own. Darker colored greens, kale, spinach, those do freeze better. They thaw, when you thaw them, you can still probably use them in a lot of different preparations, but maybe not like a kale salad, but they would go great into smoothies or egg frittatas. I oftentimes will put frozen or thawed frozen veggies into an egg frittata. They go into soups really well, so you can save those kind of darker colored greens a little bit easier, or much easier than the lightly colored greens. Dry rice will save forever, so if you haven't cooked your rice yet, I mean, it is going to last a long time. I have like a 40-pound bag of rice in my basement because that's one of the things that we buy at Costco like once or maybe twice a year, and then we have it for a really long time. I like to rinse my rice, not because I think I'm washing gluten out of it. There's no gluten in rice anyway, so you're not doing that. But I always rinse my rice before I use it because like it might be dusty from just sitting around for a while. But dry rice will stay for a really long time, so you don't necessarily need to worry too much about that. But oftentimes I will cook like a big batch of rice when I am making something with rice in it, and then I will freeze the leftovers that I don't use. When you cook and then cool rice, it actually builds something called resistant starch, which is basically just like fiber. It acts like fiber in the body. So it's actually a little bit of a health or nutrition boost to do that. Cook it and then cool it, and then you can freeze it and thaw it and use it just like you would in anything else. Now, one thing to know about cooked rice is that it can be a really effective place for bacteria to grow, and you don't want to be freezing your rice with a bunch of bacteria grown in it, because then when you thaw it and heat it again, you could get sick. And so my recommendation is, if you are going to cook rice and then freeze it, bring it down to temperature, like room temperature or cooler, very quickly, seal it up in an airtight container very quickly, and get it in the freezer. But don't seal it up while it's still warm, because that will create moisture within that container, and that is how our bacteria can really grow. So you can save rice and freeze it, but be careful about how you're doing that. Fresh herbs also do not save very well. So if you buy, one of those like containers of basil or rosemary, that is not going to stay very long in your refrigerator, but you can incorporate that into like a compound butter or an infused oil. So you would just kind of cook it on the stove for long enough that the aromatic or the flavor of those herbs seeps into your fat, whether you're using butter or olive oil. And then you can actually freeze the butter or the olive oil, and it will have those herbs in it, and it will give you just like kind of a fancy butter. And then when you thaw that butter, it'll just be a little bit of extra flavor, and you won't just be like using a couple of basil leaves for one recipe and then, throwing the rest away. Onions also have a really long shelf life, but I particularly love red onions, pickled red onions specifically. And so if we have some red onions that are like about to turn, I will oftentimes ask my husband, honestly, to pickle those red onions. And that's because I really love them that way. They will last a really, really long time when they're pickled. Pickling is actually like an ancient form of food preservation. So a really effective way to keep a red onion, if it is, you can also certainly do that with any cucumbers you have left. And I know other people will pickle other types of vegetables as well. Now, my husband loves carrots, especially, like a whole carrot. So it's not often that we have those long enough that they're going to go bad. Carrots, another item that will last a really long time naturally. But if you do have carrots that have been sticking around in your refrigerator for a long time, you can certainly freeze them and then use them. I would cut them up into like small pieces, or maybe even shred your carrot, and then you can freeze them and they go in soups beautifully. But another thing you can do with whole carrots, if you have them, is dip them or soak them in broth, chicken broth, beef broth, something like that, ideally low sodium broth. And then you can freeze those and give them to your dogs. And they're like a really good, inexpensive kind of chew toy for your dogs. And, they're really healthy if they, or when they inevitably eat those carrots. It's good for your dogs. It's going to give them some vitamins, some minerals. Now, because my husband doesn't drink, oftentimes I will open a bottle of wine and not finish it by myself. And so you can freeze wine. It might change the texture a little bit. It might change the flavor a little bit. So I wouldn't do it with like like a really nice or really fancy wine if you can help it, but you can freeze wine, and then when you thaw it, you can use it in a soup, you can use it in a sauce, you can use it to make a slushy, cook up like a big sauce or a big soup and freeze it actually cooked already and incorporate that wine into it while you're cooking, while it's still good, and then freeze it fully formed so that when you want to use it later, you're not just like pulling out an ice cube of wine, but you are pulling out, say, that sauce. And I mentioned ice cube because, again, wine, very high water content, and so it will also expand when you freeze it. And so you don't want to freeze it like in the bottle. You want to freeze it by pouring it into like an ice cube tray, silicone tray, something that can expand while it freezes. And then it's also, you know, if you have half a bottle of wine that's frozen and you're not gonna use a whole half a bottle when you freeze it or when you thaw it, it's also just easier to pour it into individual kind of ice cube size or silicone kind of mold size, single servings. So when you pull one out, you can just throw that into the soup or the sauce that you're making rather than thawing and then trying to refreeze like a whole half bottle of wine. Now, a few things that do freeze really well. The first one is tofu. I also tend to freeze cartons of egg whites. Again, you can separate your eggs and your egg whites and freeze them that way. During especially like the last year, eggs have been really expensive and whole eggs have been difficult to get at the grocery store sometimes, but egg whites were always fairly easy to get. So there would be times when I couldn't get eggs and I would just get egg whites instead, and I freeze those. Bread also freezes really nicely. I have things like English muffins that I always keep frozen and then pull them out and thaw to make like breakfast sandwiches, and like lasagna. Lasagna tends to be a classic frozen item. Soups freeze really well, and don't think that just because you can buy something frozen means that you can freeze it yourself at home and it will work out. So these are things to keep in mind if you are doing a project pantry, a low buy, or if you are just kind of stocking up while you're at the grocery store. You see things are on sale. My first tip is to use the things in your fridge that are not going to last and are the closest to turning. Use those things up first. My second tip is know what freezes well and know what doesn't freeze well. And then my third tip is to transform the things that don't freeze well into a form that they will freeze well. That's the way that you can kind of use up and combine things from your refrigerator with things in your pantry. So as you're using up your project pantry items, you will be able to combine some of them with the fresh stuff in your refrigerator. So the first thing I made for meal prep this week was some high protein pancakes. I used up the cottage cheese that had been in my refrigerator. I had about a cup of cottage cheese left, and that was the perfect amount to make a double batch of these high protein Kodiak cake pancakes. I will link the recipe down in the description, but essentially I was just combining my normal Kodiak cake pancake mix with some eggs and some cottage cheese. Now, I'm not the kind of person who typically uses cottage cheese in this way. I typically will just eat cottage cheese with some fresh fruit, but we didn't have any fresh fruit, so I decided to turn these into pancakes instead. And I eat these protein pancakes pretty often for breakfast. I will actually just cook them on a sheet pan, and then I reheat them when I'm ready to eat them just in the toaster. It's super easy, and pancakes do stay in the fridge and even freeze pretty well. So pro tip, if you have extra cottage cheese, extra milk, extra yogurt, you can certainly turn them into pancakes. The recipe I used said to combine all these things in a blender, but I tried to use my stand mixer first instead because my blender is just a single serve smoothie blender, and so I wanted to avoid using that if I could. I did eventually decide to give up on the hand mixer and use my smoothie blender. I just was not getting the cottage cheese to be smooth like I wanted it to be for this pancake mix. So now I'm adding cinnamon and allspice to the pancake mix. I always do this when I make protein pancakes. You can see my dogs here playing right behind me. I have 2 cattle dogs, and then I also have a pit bull, so these 2 are wild. Because I ended up using my blender, especially after using the hand mixer, they did get very smooth, but also they were pretty well whipped, and I think that allowed them to be like very light and very fluffy. Now the second thing that I made this week is hard-boiled eggs, and I just make my hard-boiled eggs in my Instant Pot. Super easy, super quick. You just set them to pressure cook for 5 minutes, and then after they cook for 5 minutes, you let them self-depressurize or whatever, just stay in the Instant Pot for 5 minutes. And then after that, I put them into ice water to kind of stop the cooking. And anytime you make hard-boiled eggs, that putting them in the ice water after they are done cooking is what will prevent them from getting that kind of like green ring around the yolk. If you are just eating them, it doesn't really matter if you have that green ring. It just, doesn't look as good, but you can just put them into ice water to stop the cooking. That is especially useful if you are making like deviled eggs or something and you don't want that green color. Then I just cool them off to get them to stop cooking, dry them off. These are really for my husband. I don't really eat them, but they're one of the things that he will eat for breakfast. Then I had pulled pork in the freezer, and I just pulled that out for my lunches this week. And then I was gonna eat that with chips and pickled red onions, but I found that I had in my pantry a cornbread mix. So I ended up actually just whipping up some cornbread. And so instead of using the tortilla chips, I made cornbread, and then I, again, didn't have any fresh fruit. So this is what it actually looked like when I ate it for lunch. Not beautiful, but fits my plate pretty well. That was an easy breakfast and lunches for this week. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one.